Florida State to the playoffs? uh, I've done a few of these videos. I did a Tennessee one. And then was it yesterday? I did Southern Cal. But ESPN put an article out a week or so ago where they go through their top 25 and they give like a little paragraph or whatever on what each team needs to do in order to make the playoffs. It isn't about winning a national title or winning a conference or whatever. It's specifically about just making the playoffs. Um, they've actually got Florida State number 4 in the ranking that they used for this article. I think that's the highest I've seen Florida State ranked in anybody's preseason rankings, whether you're talking, websites like ESPN or Fox or whoever, or whether you're talking about individuals that put out rankings or even idiot YouTubers like me. And I've got Florida State in my top 10. I think I have them at 8 or 9, but this is by far the highest ranked I've seen Florida State in anybody's ranking. But in this particular article, they've got Florida State at 4, and they list they have about 3 things they say Florida State needs to do to make the playoffs in 2023. Florida State did have a good season last year. I mean, there's no denying that. First 10-win season in a long time for them, seems like. Big win over LSU at the beginning of the season, which honestly didn't really get the respect or the credit it deserved, because people didn't have a very high opinion of LSU. It might be hard to remember, but last offseason and heading into the season, and even for the first few weeks of the season, people didn't have that high of an opinion of LSU. So when Florida State beat them on opening weekend, nobody really knew what to make of that. That was a win by Florida State that looked better and better as the season went along, because, of course, LSU ended up beating Alabama, winning the SEC West, and all that. So that win looked better. And, Florida State continued to roll last season after that first win. I think they got to 4 or 5-0. And then they lost 3 games in a row. Clemson, Wake Forest, and NC State. And then they won out the rest of the regular season, including a win over Florida at the end of the regular season, and then a win over Oklahoma, I guess it was, in the bowl game, and finished 10-3. So a good season for Florida State, and they've got a ton coming back, as this article mentioned, starting with quarterback Jordan Travis. But it's not just Jordan Travis. Bill Connolly, who does the S&P index and the S&P rankings, if you guys know what that is or even care, I don't know, but he ranks returning production, not specifically not number of returning starters. That's something different, but percentage of returning production. And Florida State has 87% of its production from last year returning. That's everything from passing yards to rushing yards, receiving yards, sacks, tackles, interceptions, you name it. 87% of their total production from last year is coming back. So I understand the hype, I guess, that Florida State is getting this offseason, and I can completely understand why Florida State fans would be excited heading into this year. Probably the most excited I've seen Florida State fans since at least 2016 or 2017. And I think Florida State will be a good team. Now, before I get into what the article is talking about, let's just talk about their schedule. Now, they're in the ACC. The ACC has done away with divisions, so there's no worrying about winning a division to make the ACC title game. It's just going to be, at the end of the regular season, the 2 ACC teams with the best record, right? So you have to keep that in mind. And, of course, this does not include Notre Dame, even though Notre Dame plays a handful of ACC teams every year. They do not play Florida State, by the way, this year. But when you look at Florida State's schedule, they have a rematch with LSU, again in week 1. Now, technically, it's a neutral site game, just like last year's game. Last year's game was played in New Orleans, about an hour from Baton Rouge, or hour and a half, whatever it is. And this year's game, neutral site game, played in Orlando. This might be one of the silliest neutral site deals I've ever seen. It's crazy enough. I don't like neutral site games, so just know that I'm coming at this from that perspective to start with. I don't like neutral site games at all outside of the postseason. Bowl games, but in conference championship games. But it's one thing to play like one of these kickoff classics like Georgia played Oregon last year. It's just a one-game deal. You play in a neutral site. Georgia played Clemson the year before, a kickoff classic in Charlotte, a one-game deal. If you're going to schedule 2 games in a row, with a team. Can't you make it home and home? I don't understand why Florida State had to travel from Tallahassee past New Orleans to or short of Baton Rouge, stop in New Orleans and play the game there. Couldn't they have traveled the extra hour to Baton Rouge and made it a home game? And now LSU returns the favor. They're traveling to Florida. They're going to travel past Tallahassee, right? Literally right past it. Drive right through it, fly right over it to Orlando to play this thing. It's just weird. Anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent on neutral site games. I do have a video coming up about neutral site games because it looks like the Georgia-Florida game is getting moved out of Jacksonville finally. But anyway, when you look at Florida State's schedule, so they start off with LSU again. Now, this game's going to receive the hype it deserves this year. Last year, nobody was talking about this game in the offseason, heading into the season. Neither one of these teams was ranked. LSU had fired Brian Kelly. Florida State had been kind of, circling the drain for several years under Mike Norvell. Just no one paid attention to this game. It ended up being a great game, but again, no one knew what to make of it because LSU wasn't very well respected heading into the season. Obviously, our perspective on both of those teams, Florida State and LSU, changed a great deal as the season went along. This offseason, that game's getting a lot of hype. A lot of hype. I get a lot of calls about it, a lot of comments about it. It's getting the respect it deserves this year. So that's going to be a tough game for Florida State, obviously. They beat them last year. We'll see if they can do it again. They play on the road at Clemson. And then in back-to-back weeks, they play on the road at Wake Forest and on the road at Pitt. Those are probably their four toughest games. Now, they got Miami on the schedule and they got Florida on the schedule. I don't think Miami is going to be as bad as last year. Mario Cristobal's first year in Miami was an absolute failure and just a disaster outside of recruiting. Which, it really only helps you 2-3 years down the road. There's not much for Miami fans to be excited about. I do think they'll be better this year than last year, but Florida State beat them like 45-3 or something like that last year. So, okay, maybe they beat them by 3 touchdowns instead of 6 this year or whatever the case. But, right now, I wouldn't consider that Miami game to be one of Florida State's toughest games. Same thing with Florida at the end of the year. Florida may have a worse record this year than they had last year. LSU on the road at Clemson, on the road at Wake Forest, on the road at Pitt. How many of those games do they lose? One of the knocks on Florida State, yeah, they went 10-3 last year, but when you hear people kind of, saying, hey, let's pump the brakes a little, usually what they point to is the fact that, yes, Florida State was 10-3. Yes, they beat Oklahoma in a bowl game. Yes, they beat in-state rival Florida. Yes, they beat SEC West winner LSU. But their record against ranked teams was 1-3. They played 4 ranked teams. LSU, who they beat, and then the 3 teams they lost to in a row. Clemson, NC State, Wake Forest, all L's. So 1-3 against ranked teams. Now, okay, they're not going to play a whole lot of ranked teams again this year either. LSU will be ranked. Clemson will be ranked. Outside of that, Wake Forest, they lost their quarterback, Sam Hartman, who was really the only thing keeping their head above water. They may not be ranked. Pitt, no, stop. Just stop. So, they're only going to play 3 or 4 ranked teams probably again. They went 1-3 against ranked teams last year. Can they go 2-2? Can they go 3-1? That's the difference between, 9-3 like they were last year or potentially 10-2, 11-1. Or hell, even 12-0. I don't want to sell them short. I mean, I think 4 is a little too high, but that's where they have them in this ranking. But so what does Florida State need to do, according to this article, to make the playoffs this year? Well, number one, according to this article, Jordan Travis has to stay healthy. I could not agree more. Jordan Travis might be the most improved quarterback like from 2 or 3 years ago to now in all of college football. He started out as a guy that, how you have some quarterbacks and people will say, he ain't even a quarterback. He's a running back playing quarterback. That's what a lot of people, myself included, were saying about Jordan Travis. He was a hell of an athlete. He could run around. He's very mobile. He wasn't a very good thrower of the football. Well, that's really developed some over the last couple of years. He's played really good quarterback, especially last year. Not just an athlete playing quarterback. He's actually been a good quarterback, in my opinion. So, yeah, he's got to stay healthy. He's the most important piece of that team on offense and maybe the entire team overall. And they just don't have a lot of experience or anything behind him. at the quarterback position. Now, you can make this argument about a lot of teams, right? A lot of teams would be in bad shape if they lost their starting quarterback. So this isn't anything specific to Florida State, but really high expectations. And one of the keys to getting there, according to this article, keep Jordan Travis healthy. Also says more production from their outside wide receivers. Again, this is something that everyone's always looking for, right? Everybody watches Ohio State play on TV, and they're like, how come we don't have 4 NFL wide receivers? Well, because you're not Ohio State. This is something Uncle Lou's been complaining about with Georgia for a long, long time. I mean, we had George Pickens, but unfortunately, health kept him out for almost his entire last year at Georgia. A.D. Mitchell last year, which was probably our best or most talented wide receiver anyway, played week 1 and then didn't play again until the playoffs. A lot of teams would love to have better, wide receiver ones or quality out. Look at Alabama, led the country in drop passes last year. And Alabama's normally a team that's got a couple of NFL wide receivers on the outside every year. Not last year, led the league in drop passes. Alabama swimming in the poverty pond lately. Anyway, back to Florida State. And they got to be better on defense against the run. And this was something I noticed, too, before I even read this stat here. And you can see they gave up 250 yards rushing on the last 2 games of the year against Florida and Oklahoma. That's something I noticed watching both of those games, is that they were not great against the run. Now, in both of those games, they were able to move the ball and score points. So it didn't matter, as much as maybe it's going to matter going forward in some of their bigger games. LSU, for example, if Jaden Daniels is quarterback for LSU, he's somebody that can burn you with his legs. Clemson has one of the best running backs in the country in Will Shipley. These are games that can get away from Florida State if they don't tighten up with the run defense. And Clemson in particular, and LSU too, both have defenses or talented enough defenses that can give Florida State problems offensively too. So if Florida State's not able to move up and down the field and they can't stop the run in those games, I can see where that could be a problem. And a couple of losses would probably be enough to keep Florida State out of the playoffs. So I agree with all 3 of these reasons here, or things for Florida State, things they need to do to make the playoffs. The thing is, all 3 of these things could happen. Jordan Travis could stay healthy. They could get better play from the wide receivers, and the run defense could be improved, and they could still miss out on the playoffs. I don't know if Florida State yet is ready to take that next step to playoff caliber team, right? Florida State this year, to me, is a prime example of why some people are extremely excited about the possibility of a 12-team playoff. Not that Florida State would win the national title, but Florida State is a team that if we had 12 playoff format this year, Florida State would be almost a lock probably to make that. Not sure they're going to be able to finish the season and win the ACC, which might include having to beat Clemson twice, or at least play them twice, to win the ACC and make the college football playoff as one of the best 4 teams. I'm just not sure Florida State has yet what it takes to do that. But we'll see. This isn't a prediction video. Who knows? I may change my mind by the time I start doing predictions in May and June. But hard for me to imagine right now that Florida State ends up as one of the final 4 teams. And again, I'm high on Florida State. I've got them in my top 10. So it's not like I would be shocked if they made it. But if you were to force me right now to make a prediction, yes or no, does Florida State make the playoffs, I'd say no. But I do think they're one of, 10, 12, 15 teams that's got a shot. They got an opportunity. I don't know if I would have them as high as this ranking has them at number 4. Again, I've got them at like 8 or 9 right now. I only do 3 different top 25s in the offseason. I've got the one that's out now that I do right after signing day in February. I'll do a second one after all the spring games have been played, and I get to watch some of these teams play. We get to see some of these quarterbacks play who, for teams who are replacing quarterbacks. Georgia's got to replace a lot of highly ranked teams are replacing their quarterbacks. Georgia, Stetson Bennett, gone. Going to be starting somebody who's never started a game, whether it's Carson Beck, Brock Vandagriff, or Gunnar Stockton. None of them have ever started. Alabama loses Bryce Young. Jalen Mildew does have 1 start, but he didn't impress anybody. A lot of the fans want Ty Simpson to get the start. He'll be a second-year guy this year, I guess. So we'll see what happens and what plays out there. Ohio State, of course, has lost C.J. Stroud. They got a quarterback to replace. Anyway, a lot of your highly ranked teams are replacing quarterbacks. So you watch the spring game, you kind of get an idea maybe which direction some of these teams are heading. I do a second top 25 after the spring games. Then I do a third and final preseason ranking about a month or so before the season starts. But what do y'all think about Florida State this year? Hard to just pretend that 1-3 record against ranked teams last year doesn't exist. I mean, that is kind of a frustrating stat, I guess. 1-3 against ranked teams. You know, win against LSU, 9-3 in the regular season, 10-3 after a win over Oklahoma in the bowl game. Anyway, let me know what y'all think down below about Florida State, and also any other teams you want to hear my thoughts on as far as what they need to do to make the playoffs or whatever. Comment that down below too, and we'll see what we can do. Have a good morning and that.